We are now in your United States history book. We're in chapter 3, section 3, and we're going to be talking about the advancements in learning, which has to do with, libraries and colleges, the education and newspaper, all these things that would have to come about for America to be civilized in colonies and to grow. They would have to focus on education, wouldn't they? So let's begin. The Americans interested in education. Now, you can look at some of these pictures here, and you can see, how they educated in different, especially in different parts of America. They all needed education for freedom to survive. They knew that. They knew that they needed to have their kids educated so that they could survive in this world, especially in the New World in America. With education, they could rule themselves wisely, and they wouldn't have to be ruled by a feudalism type proprietor or kings, right? The English Puritans were very interested in education. Why? Because they wanted to read the Bible. And if you couldn't read, you couldn't read and write, you were illiterate, then you couldn't read the Bible, or you couldn't be a preacher of the Bible if you couldn't read the Bible. So Puritans, their whole focus was on being able to read the Bible, and their education was on reading and writing. The Puritans set out to build a college to educate their ministers. We'll find the first college they built, of course, in Massachusetts. Remember, Massachusetts is that Puritan colony there, settled mainly Puritans. They built Harvard University in Boston, Cambridge area. That Harvard University would be the very first college in America. And it would be a Puritan college based on learning to be a pastor or a preacher, right? Harvard, 1636, first college in the Massachusetts Bay for Puritan education. It was founded in Cambridge, which is near Boston, in honor of the English Cambridge, so there's an English Cambridge. So it was the first institution of higher learning college. Young men studied Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Greek and Hebrew because the Bible, basically the Bible was originally written in Greek and Hebrew, and Latin too, as the Latin Vulgate. Those all had to do for ministry, to know Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Latin was the Roman Catholic language, right? So they needed to know all three. The purpose was to let every student know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life. That's pretty beautiful. If you go to Harvard now, you'll see this, but it's long gone. There's no foundation on about God in Harvard anymore. But in the beginning, 1636, a long time ago there, when America was settled. See, America was settled started being settled in 1620, right, for the Pilgrims. So this wasn't too long. This was pretty early that they organized a college, or founded a college for the Puritans. The Common School and Old Deluder Act. Okay, what's Old Deluder Act? It's very important you know this, right? In America, everyone needed to be able to read scripture because all these different faiths came. And if you didn't know scripture, if you didn't know the Bible, you're going to be easily deceived, right? So in 1642, law was for a parent to see that their children had to be taught to read so their children could read the Bible. So in 1647, they passed a law, Old Deluder Satan Act. Old Deluder Satan Act in Massachusetts. That's what we're talking about. Massachusetts are mainly Puritans, and they were strict on this, that they wanted to make sure their kids could read. So they required if a town had 50 or more people, that they would be required, they had to hire a teacher for those 50 people. If they had 100 or more, they had to provide a whole school, a grammar school. So they would say, if you have 50 people in your town, you better get a teacher. If you have 100 people in your town, you got to have a school. So this would prevent Satan from keeping men from reading the scriptures. The first public education in America happened because people recognized the need to read the Bible. So here's some pictures. I like this up here. It says, in Adam's fall, we, oh, I can't read it there. Oh, we finished all our, thy life to mend, this book to attend, the calf to play, and after flay. A dog will bite, a thief at night, an eagle flight is out of flight, the idle fool is whipped at school. Well, you can translate that. So anyway, so let's go on. Basically here it talks about the outcomes and compliances, and of course if they had 50 or more families required to have a teacher, so in a school at 100. William Scant of Braintree, Massachusetts came before the court for breaking the old Deluder Satan Act, which he never did, because more than a century after that, the act was passed, and President John Adams, drafted the Massachusetts Constitution with the guarantee of public education for all citizens. So that's why public education was guaranteed. It set a precedent for public education. Let's just say that. This old Deluder Act. The first school books in New England, we have some pictures. The first book was called the Horn Book over here. It looked like a little paddle horn. The shapeboard was printed alphabet, and the Lord's Prayer and stuff would be on their horn book. So first you get a horn book. The next you get a primer, the New England primer here. And that was the most widely used textbook with word lists and poems and prayers and Bible study in their primer. And then they would read, of course, the Bible, and they all had to read Pilgrim's Progress. I know you had to read that too. But they had to read Pilgrim's Progress with the Bible to be able to read, and some classics. Some schools brought in classics for them to read. Reading was the most important for them. The middle colonies, they had a Latin grammar schools were more successful. They had when you say Latin was kind of a language in part of Europe, especially the part of Europe that was Roman Catholic, as the churches back then were in Latin. But they would have Latin grammar schools that were more successful, the private schools, more successful than the public schools. In 1750, the middle colonies Latin grammar school was replaced by private academics with Latin and Greek curriculum. So not only Latin, they would have Greek. Middle colonies being a little more wealthy than the New England colonies. Also, they had English composition and literature and mathematics and modern languages and philosophy and natural science. In Philadelphia had the first college that was not based on a church. And it was founded by Benjamin Franklin, who was a scientist, right? And later it was called the University of Pennsylvania. This was in the middle colonies. In the southern colonies, what did they do in the southern? Well, they had large plantations, so the schools would be far apart, so they'd have to walk long distance for schools. So what they did is they usually hired tutors, and they started small old field schools in their fields. Here's a picture of an old field school. So they were small because they only were mainly for the plantations that were close by, or the plantations, those children, that lived next to each other, or maybe just the family. The wealthy hired tutors. They sent children to England for higher education. So if you had a lot of money, you could send, a lot of the plantation owners did, they would actually send their kids to England to go to college in England, and then come back, being cool. They went to college in England. Some would hire tutors for several families. The old field school right here, picture of the old field school, started in the tobacco fields. So they have the tobacco fields and they have an old field school there with private tutors. Dame schools. What's a dame school? Was a school for girls. The girls would be able to go to school in the dame schools, and grammar schools and private colleges, mission and charity schools were all in the southern colonies. Apprenticeships. What was apprenticeship? When young boys were giving certain trades, they were brought in and made apprentices, and they worked they worked for free because they were learning, right? And so it would help that person, the craftsman, because he'd get extra work for free, of course, but also he'd be training this young man so that he could learn the craft or learn the trade. And they usually, apprenticeships were for 7 years. It's kind of weird because it's like 7 years in the Bible, they have these same kind of apprenticeships. And they were taught the skills of the trade, whatever trade. Here's cooking trade, right? And here's a weaving trade. There's shoemaking. I think they're making shoes. Shoemaking, so a lot of different trades to learn, these apprenticeships. Well, there also was very high literacy because most colonies received a sound education because they wanted everyone to read and write, right? So by 1776, America became the most literate country in the world. So can you believe that? America, the colonists that came from Europe, and maybe in Europe they couldn't even read and write. They were poor, but when they came to America, they became literate. They knew if they learned to read and write, that would give them a jump on their life, that they would be able to do other things. John Adams was the second president, said, "A native of America who cannot read and write is very rare, almost as rare as a comet or an earthquake." Most people in America could read and write. And there were colleges that were established. Remember Harvard was? But now the higher education, 9 colleges were founded before 1776. 9 colleges. That's pretty quickly as building colleges. In fact, here's some of this college campus here, and you see the campus were pretty elaborate by that time, And that was only, 100 and some years, come after America was founded. I say founded when the first pilgrims came. Okay, the colleges. We have Harvard, Harvard University in 1636. We have the College of William and Mary in Virginia right there in 1693. We have Yale. I think this one's Yale University in 1701 by the Congregationalists or the Puritans. Puritans were Congregationalists. The College of New Jersey in Princeton in 1747 by Presbyterians. King's College or Columbia University in 1754 by Anglicans or English Anglicans. Rhode Island University was Brown's University that was founded in 1764 by the Baptists. Then in 1766, Queen's College, which is called Rutgers. These colleges are still there by the Dutch Reformed. Dartmouth College in 1769 by Congregationalists, again, Puritans. And then, of course, we have the University of Pennsylvania right here. We have a picture of Benjamin Franklin. That was the only one that wasn't sponsored by a church. The only secular college was Ben Franklin's. So these were all pictures of the different colleges back then. Books and libraries. So, well, when they first came, few people could afford books. Books were pretty expensive, and they didn't have printing presses right away, right? But later, they became available, and Americans became avid readers. They loved to read. They didn't have televisions, they didn't have phones and all this, but they read, and they loved to read books. So many very wealthy people in America would have personal libraries. And they would read theology, history, math, philosophy, science, and classics. They'd read all of that. In 1638, Cambridge, where Harvard is, had a printing press and printed books. In 1640, the first book that was printed was the Bay Psalms book. It was out of the Bible, of course. And most books and writing were historical or religious. So if somebody was going to write a book, it would either be religious about, freedom of religion, or about something to do with the Bible, or, a journal from the Bible and such, or it'd be historical. Some famous historical old books of America would be John Smith, Captain John Smith. Remember him, of Virginia? Yes, who Pocahontas saved his life. Remember John Smith? He wrote a history. And then, of course, we have the William Bradfords, which is a real, true Pilgrim's Progress, because William Bradford was a pilgrim, was on the Mayflower, and he wrote the first historic account in America of Plymouth Plantation that we can even read today. And then there was a guy named Thomas Hutchinson here, and he wrote the history of the home colony, and he was one of the royal governors. And he wrote about how the colonies lived, the history of the colonies. So three important historians: John Smith, William Bradford, and Thomas Hutchinson. Newspapers, the colonial newspapers. So news traveled very slowly. We know that. So they needed newspapers. But many were informed on events because they were looking to see what was happening in England and Europe that would affect America. So they were interested. And so they started to develop these newspapers. The first newspaper was in 1704 by a man named John Campbell. And he had the first government-owned newspaper in Boston. Remember, Boston is where a lot of things started in Boston. Just remember that. Well, this Boston newsletter, and he put forth this Boston newspaper, which everyone read, and it went not just in Boston, but all over. And then on to the New England Current here. It was the first private newspaper. And 1721 it was published by James Franklin, which was Benjamin Franklin's brother. And he published that was one of the first private. The first public was the Boston, and then the New Current was by James Franklin, which was published in the New England Current, called the New England Current. In 1776, by the time America became a nation, there were 37 newspapers. Here's one of the Virginia Gazette, an old newspaper in Virginia. So this precedent was set for freedom of the press. Okay, what happened back when? In 1734, a guy named John Peter Zenger. This is not John Peter Zenger, but I couldn't find a picture of him. But he lived 1696 to 1746. Well, John Peter Zenger, he was a newspaper guy and a printer. He was a German printer, and he was the editor of the New York. We're talking about New York Now journal. And Zenger was brought to trial because he was criticized, the governor of New York. Remember that the governor of New York was not a good guy, right? Well, we have the Duke of York, and then the governor that was set for New York. So he was criticizing the governor. So the governor says, we're gonna put him in jail, or we're gonna, he can't criticize me. I'm the governor, right? But Zenger was defended by the most famous lawyer probably in all of history, and his name was Alexander Hamilton. So this is a picture of Alexander Hamilton, which boosted his career. Hamilton was one of George Washington's right-hand men, when he was younger. And Hamilton, I'm not going to go into Alexander Hamilton because we'll go into that later on, but he had quite a life. But anyway, Alexander Hamilton was defended, and Hamilton convinced the jury to find Zenger not guilty, and he proved that what Zenger printed about the governor, the bad things he printed, was actually true. So this was a precedent set for the news to have freedom to print the truth. So if you're going to print the truth, print the truth. And so he was printing the truth about what the governor of New York had done. And so the Zenger was not prosecuted. So this now set the freedom of the press, and it's in the Bill of Rights now. And Alexander Hamilton came forth, and Zenger was not guilty because he was telling the truth. Pretty important for newspaper. Politically astute people. We're going to end this here with Thomas Jefferson. So, the maintenance of free society requires political educated people to have a representative government in order to rule themselves, which is the foundation of Christian morality. Thomas Jefferson says, "I know no safe diplomacy but ultimate powers of society, but the people themselves. If we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education." So he's saying, basically saying, America needs to be educated. and to be educated clearly and truly, right? And that's the remedy. If we're going to have representative government and the people ruling, we need to have the people educated. Basically, that's what he said. So that's it for education. I have one little section on government and we'll be done with chapter 3.